Hi, I'm Roger and welcome back to the channel. Recently had someone ask me, as a homeowner, what size chainsaw should they buy to cut firewood to heat their home with. Typically in this area, if you have a wood stove, you're going to burn between 3 to 5 cords of wood per year. So the saw isn't going to see a tremendous amount of use, but it still needs to be reliable. So before I get into that, I want to give you a little bit of background about myself. I cut and sell a little bit of firewood. I work on chainsaws from time to time, and my family has always heated our house with firewood. So in a way you can kind of say I've always been around chainsaws, not to the extent of like someone that's like a logger has been, but you know, my dad always had a chainsaw. All the saws that I'm going to be talking about in this video are going to be steel saws. That's what my dad's always used. That's what we've always used to cut firewood with. We've always had great luck with them. My great uncle cut pulpwood years ago. He ran steels when we first got a steel dealer in this area. He started out running, I think, 031s, and he always had great luck with those saws. The guy that I bought these logs off of, he runs steel saws, and he told me, before I even told him that I ran steel saws cutting firewood, he said he had somebody ask him where he got his saws worked on, and he told him he ran steel saws that he didn't have to get them worked on. And that's just about the truth. If you run a steel saw, they're extremely reliable. I'm not saying they're bulletproof, but you know how like people talk about Hondas and Toyotas, how they're so reliable and so far superior to everything on the road when they're really not any better than anything else? Well, steel saws do about live up to that reputation. They are a great saw. And then the next reason about steel saws is the dealer network. You cannot beat the steel dealer network. There are several steel dealers in my area. I think there's like 4 real close here. And the one dealer that I always go to, they're really, really great to deal with. They always treat me very fairly, actually more than fairly. The primary focus of this video is to help you decide what size chainsaw is right for you, because I know it's very, very overwhelming. And then I'm also going to touch briefly on some other things that you should buy when you buy your chainsaw. I know as a new chainsaw owner that stuff is also going to be confusing. So when you start looking at chainsaws, you're going to see that your reputable brands have 3 different qualities of saws. The first is occasional use, which is geared towards homeowners. The occasional use chainsaws or homeowner grade saws are still way, way better chainsaws than what you're going to buy in the box store. I don't have all of the saws that I'm going to recommend because I'm not sponsored by Steel and they didn't send me all the saws. These are my own personal saws. But the first saw I'm going to recommend is a Steel MS250. In my opinion, that is one of the best values in a chainsaw that you can buy, whether it's a pro grade saw, non-pro saw, or any brand chainsaw. They were like around $300. I'm not sure about the current pricing with all the craziness going on, but I used to have an MS250 and mine was the easy start model. I got rid of it because I have several other saws and didn't need it. But this saw is a Steel 026, and I ran the MS250 against an 026. I have several 026s, and the MS250 cut just as good as the 026. Every once in a while with the 026, you'll find one that runs really, really good, but like your average running 026, the MS250, which is a non-pro saw, cuts just as good as your average running 026 or MS260 that is a pro grade saw. And the reason for that is on these 026 MS260s is there were several different carburetors and mufflers they had on them. Some of the mufflers were more restrictive and some of the carburetors were smaller that made some of these 026s run not so great. The 026 is a non-pro saw, and the biggest difference in a pro grade saw and a non-pro saw is going to be what's called the crankcase. This crankcase is magnesium. Then on this MS290, it's plastic. So and then with the saw being plastic, it also makes it heavier than what the comparable size pro grade saw is. But for a homeowner, an MS250 is a very, very good saw. And even though it's plastic, it still has a really good power to weight ratio. Moving on up through the saws, if you go into the mid-range saws, or the farm and ranch saws as Steel calls them, this is like the best-selling steel saw for years, the MS290. This saw actually has an MS390 top end on it, and it's been modified. It has a muffler mod and some other things done to it. So I'm not going to run it in this video because I want you to see stock saws. But this saw has recently been replaced within probably the past 5 years or so with the MS-271. So if you want to step up, get maybe a little more robust saw, the MS-271 and then the MS-291, which would be a larger piston and cylinder on that, which would be more cc's, give you a little bit more power in the same size saw, would also be another good option. Then they also have an MS-311 and a 391. I think they are on a slightly larger chassis, so it'd be a little bit bigger saw and more power. But the problem with the 391, in my opinion, is the price. Like, yeah, they say, I think you can run a 24-inch bar on that saw, and I wouldn't really get caught up in that stuff too much. That means that it'll just pretty much oil a bar that long, in my opinion. But the problem with that saw is the price. Once you get up to that price, you're going to be somewhere in the price range of a pro grade saw now. And if you go on forums, you'll see guys hate these non-pro saws, but the non-pro saws are still really, really good saws, and they're great for homeowners. But if I were to buy a saw, I wouldn't buy a 391. I'd buy an MS-261. And these saws, like $550, $600, somewhere in that price range. And the one I would get would be an MS-261C, like this. That means it's an M-tronic saw. And your regular saws have 4 positions on the switch. I'll move this around right. You can see this one has 3: choke, run, stop. Your regular saws have a fast idle, so that's another easy way to identify an M-tronic saw. Now what M-tronic is, it's a computerized carburetor. You don't realize it, but with your regular saw, like when the weather changes, if you are cutting at sea level and then you start cutting at 5,000 feet in elevation, if your air filter gets a little clogged, just several different factors affect the way the saw runs. The computer will take care of it, and it will richen the carburetor up or lean the carburetor. Whereas with a typical chainsaw, you may need to adjust the carburetor. And as a firewood cutter, these are great saws because of that, and they throttle up extremely fast. So like really, even when you get to the MS-271, 291, I believe they're getting up around $400. For another $150, you can get this saw that would go from 3.5 horsepower on the 271, I believe, to about 4 horsepower, and the weight's about the same. So these saws are amazing saws. Now, if you look online, it used to be everybody, when they'd recommend a saw, like if you told them you're going to buy one saw, especially if you're looking to use it to make money, not just for personal use, they would say get a 60cc saw, because 60cc saw is a good one saw plan, and that's why I have this 034 Super, which would be comparable to an MS-362. But with the power they're getting out of the MS-261 now, that saw's not very far off of what this 034 Super does, which is the same as a 036 or the later MS-360. And it's really not that far off of that, and it's a tad bit lighter. And then with the computerized carburetor, it's just a way better running saw. I mean, that would be my top pick if that fits in your budget. If you don't quite have the budget, an MS-250 at $300 is an excellent saw. Now what I've done, I have gas and oil in each one of these saws here, the MS-261, to show you how it cuts in comparison to an older 60cc saw. And I'm going to take the bar and chain off of this saw and put on the 261 so they're running the same saw, the same chain. And then I'm going to show you how this 026 cuts, so you can kind of get an idea of how a MS-250 would compare. I have 3 marks 16 inches apart. So I'm going to cut with the 034 Super, which is 60 cc's first. 026s, and I wasn't thinking when I grabbed that one up, I really don't like that style chain that's on that saw. It's a slower cutting chain, so the time for that saw is going to be a little bit slower than what it should be. Which brings up the next thing I want to talk about is the bar and chains for your saws. So this is an MS261. I temporarily took the 20-inch bar off of the 034 Super, so they both would be running the same bar and chain for this comparison. But this is a 20-inch chain, and it is a full chisel chain. I really don't recommend a 20-inch bar on these saws. You can go to one that long, but an 18-inch bar with 325 chain really works good. That 3/8 chain requires a little bit more power than what this saw has, and the 325 just works better, and that's how Steel has them equipped usually, and that's the way I would get one. And then for like an MS250, if that's the saw you're interested in, they're probably going to have an 18-inch bar on that saw in at the dealer also, and an 18-inch bar on any of these saws here works great. That's even what I have on this MS290. I really like an 18-inch bar for cutting firewood. A lot of people, when they buy a saw, they think like a longer bar is better, and you really have to watch. A longer bar will actually get you into trouble, because if I'm cutting this log and then there's another log in behind it, if the tip of this bar hits another log, that's what's going to cause the kickback. So when it hits that, that's all going to fly back. I mean, that's why you have a chain brake on the saw, so when the saw flies back, your hand's going to hit it, hopefully, but you really need to watch what you're doing. And then with a longer bar, if you're cutting on the ground, you know, you have a better chance at hitting the dirt or a rock and then dulling your chain. I don't care what kind of saw you buy, if it's a non-pro, pro-grade saw, if it's a Steel, Husqvarna, whatever brand you like, if you run that saw with a dull chain, you're going to burn it up, because it overworks the saw. You're over revving it and overheating the saw. You're going to ruin it. And on a Steel, if you ruin the piston and cylinder on that saw, like this saw right here, I bet a piston and cylinder for this saw is $250 on a $550 saw. Then if you have to pay for labor to have the piston and cylinder put on there, you can kind of see you're back up to the price of a brand new saw again. So really, I think an 18-inch bar is a pretty good all-around bar for firewood. Now when you get your chain, a lot of people bash up on safety chains like they're a slower cutting chain. If you get a Steel chain that's a safety chain, the Steel chains have a 3 after them, and that designates it's a safety chain. So if it's like RS3, it's a safety chain. If it's RS, it's not a safety chain. If it's RM, it's not a safety chain. If it's RM3, it's a safety chain. The chain I would go with would be like RM3, which would be a semi-chisel chain. That chain stays sharper longer and is more forgiving, and it's also easier to sharpen than a full chisel chain. So it is great for cutting firewood, especially if you're going to be cutting dirty logs that you've skidded. Then while you're at the dealer buying the saw, I would recommend getting like 2 extra chains, so that way you have a total of 3 chains. So that way if you dull a chain, you can swap out to a new chain, then have it sharpened later or sharpen it yourself later. And then you'll still have a spare chain. Then also, one thing you definitely need to get while you're at the dealer is a 6-pack of the Steel oil. That doubles the warranty on your saw. It's kind of a no-brainer. You're going to need oil to mix with the saw, with your gas, so why not get the Steel oil to double your warranty? And it's really not a bad idea to continue to run that Steel oil for the life of the saw. Other things that you're probably going to want to get, these sunglasses that I wear like in all my videos are actually Steel safety glasses. And they're always dirty like that too. I actually have several pairs of them. I keep some in my truck, so I have sunglasses when I'm driving. Then you're going to need hearing protection. Chainsaws are very loud. And if you're going to be cutting trees down, I would highly recommend getting a forestry helmet. As you can see, it's like a hard hat, but then you also have face protection that flips up, and your hearing protection's built in. When you're cutting trees down, a lot of times when a tree falls, the top of that tree will hit some branches in another tree and knock some dead branches down. And if one of those branches would hit you in the head, this would offer some protection versus nothing. Another thing that I don't wear, but it probably would be a good idea to have some, would be a pair of chaps. Because if you're holding the saw down, then the saw would kick. You could possibly hit yourself in the leg. and the chaps are designed to stop your chainsaw chain from turning. And I think Stihl used to offer a bundle called like the Woodcutter Bundle, which was a forestry helmet and a pair of chaps for a pretty good deal. I already mentioned the Stihl oil. At that time would have probably been a good time to touch on gas cans. I would definitely recommend getting a dedicated gas can for your chainsaw or your 2-cycle equipment. And then it's really not even a bad idea to mark that. I prefer the metal cans because these cans last forever. This can's an old Lombard can. They used to make chainsaws, but it still works. And the important thing on these is to keep them capped, because if you're using gas that has ethanol in it, it seems like it goes stale extremely fast, so you need to keep it sealed off. And with a metal can, if it's sitting outside like while you're working, or if it's in a building close to a window, feel like the sunlight's not going to get in there and kind of cause the gas to go stale sooner. But a plastic can will still do the job. Then next thing you're going to need for maintenance is a way to sharpen your chain, or you can choose to have somebody to sharpen your chain. I have my Granberg file guide apart right now, doing a modification to it, but this is an Oregon file guide that is no longer available, I believe. I prefer the Granberg guide to the Oregon guide, and I have a whole video on how to use that. But this mounts on the bar of the saw and holds the file in place as a jig, and all you have to do is just push this up and back, or push it forward, take it off the tooth, because you won't want to drag a file backwards over the cutter, and push it back forward. All you're doing is just working it up and back after you get it set up properly. And I'll have that video link in the cards right now in case you want to watch it and see how one of those works. But they do an awesome job. You're going to need a round file to sharpen the cutters. The file size is going to vary depending on what size saw you buy and what chain it is equipped with. Like if it's a 3/8 or 325 chain. Then you're also going to need a flat file for maintenance on the depth gauges. This is a round file. This is what you use to sharpen your cutter. And then this is a flat file. This is what you use to file your depth gauges. Depth gauges only get filed periodically, and you need a tool to check that looks like this. This is the tool I use for depth gauge maintenance. You lay it on top, and then file to the cutter, then file to the depth gauge. It's flush with the tool. You can see that this one is in good shape. It's a brand new chain. Then one thing you're definitely going to need if you're going to be cutting trees down are some filling wedges. You're going to need various sizes, and maybe even multiples of the same size depending on what you're going to be cutting. And a smaller wedge like this even works nice if you're cutting a log on the ground and it starts to pinch. You can drive this in the cut and keep it from pinching your saw. One thing I almost forgot to talk about is bar oil. I don't see any reason to buy high dollar bar oil. The cheap bar oil that you can get for like $6 a gallon at the farm store seems to work just fine for me. Thanks for watching this video. I hope it helps you decide which size chainsaw is going to work the best for you. This video is not a replacement for the owner's manual. Be sure to read the owner's manual before using the chainsaw.